Today, I am very happy to welcome Bronwen Hunter as our speaker for today. Bronwen is a postdoctoral researcher at University of Sussex, where she recently submitted her PhD in conservation science. Bronwen's PhD focused on exploring how data from online platforms can be used to understand large-scale patterns of the hunting, trade, and consumption of bats, as well as collecting data on threat records from social media and online news. And this involved monitoring the online trade of bats using automated methods. Bronwen has a particular interest in applying AI approaches to collecting and analyzing crowdsourced data in order to inform bat conservation. And today she will be talking to us about using online platforms to understand global patterns of bat hunting, trade, and consumption. So thank you very much for joining us today, Bronwen, and we really look forward to your talk and to listening about your research.
Thank you so much for having me. This is actually the first time I'm speaking about my PhD research as a whole, so it's really, really great to be here. And yeah, as Elisa said, I'm currently working as a postdoc at Sussex, but this webinar is more focused on what I was looking at during my PhD, which was how we can use online platforms to understand global patterns of bat hunting, trade, and consumption. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. So when I started my PhD, I didn't necessarily intend to focus specifically on bats. So what I was interested in was wildlife exploitation, which we define as the hunting, trapping, consumption, and trade of wild terrestrial species. And this has been identified by the latest IPBES report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, as the second most important driver of biodiversity loss. But collecting data on which species are targeted by exploitation, the location where this is happening, and at what levels is really, really challenging. There are a number of reasons for this. So one of those is that wildlife exploitation is extremely spatially dispersed. So collecting data over large areas is extremely resource intensive. It also may be deliberately concealed because of cultural taboos around wildlife consumption or hunting, and also sometimes it may be illegal. For other threats to biodiversity, we've been able to map them at global scales, and this is really useful because it helps us to identify where is most in need of conservation research or funding. So these two maps, the top one shows the contribution of different countries towards global deforestation. The bottom shows the impact of global land use change on species richness. So for things like deforestation and land use change, we can use remote sensing, which allows us to kind of take that bigger picture. But for wildlife exploitation, we can't necessarily do that, and we have to amalgamate data from lots of different sources. And this review in 2016 found that wildlife exploitation made up less than 5% of threat data sets. So what my initial aim was to see whether we could map wildlife exploitation at regional to global scales. This has been done previously using information from the IUCN Red List. So this Harford et al. Paper took the ranges of species known to be threatened by exploitation, overlaid them, and used that to generate an impact probability. But this does have limitations because those ranges, the threats are assumed to occur across the whole range, so it's not spatially explicit. So I kind of aim to improve on this. And I use bats as a case study to look at mapping wildlife exploitation at global scales. So just a bit more background on how we kind of get data on this threat. So traditionally, field surveys might involve, for example, visiting a wildlife market and recording what is for sale and what quantities. Consumption rates or harvest rates may also be determined by conducting interviews or questionnaire surveys. And in some cases, really detailed information on wildlife harvest can be obtained by actually researchers following hunters when they go out on hunting trips and recording what's harvested. And then when thinking about trade, particularly international trade, we can also use import and export data Sometimes this is available via the CITES database, which is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. The species listed on CITES, their trade basically needs to be recorded, so that's a major data source. But what my PhD is focused on is the internet as a data source for conservation. So this can actually provide really rich insights into people's thoughts, feelings, and also interactions with the natural world. And the use of the internet or digital data for conservation research is known now as conservation culturomics. And when we're thinking about wildlife exploitation, I've kind of mocked up a few examples of what kind of data we might be interested in. So on social media, for example, people might post when they've observed a particular species or taxa available on a market, or they might document their experiences of consuming like a local delicacy. In the news, wildlife trade seizures or arrests can also often be reported. So these are the kind of information sources that I'm interested in. Just to give a couple of examples of how these methods have been used in practice. So this paper from 2015 basically involved collecting data on bat bushmeat consumption, and I think it was 8 different markets around the city of Manado in North Sulawesi in Indonesia. And then the bottom diagram is showing some results from a 2016 study that used semi-structured interviews with households in order to determine wildlife hunting and consumption practices in Madagascar. So these kind of survey methods are really resource intensive. They take a long time to set up and carry out, but they do provide super rich information. But on the other hand, online platforms have also provided us with some insights into wildlife exploitation. So one study that the results of which is shown here, they looked at posts about tiger bone wine on social media and also on the search engine Baidu in China. And they've managed to basically categorize those posts by the motivation for consuming tiger bone wine. And in that way, they identified some key drivers of consumption of that wildlife product. And this Hinsley et al. Paper also looked at wildlife trade networks relating to ornamental orchids on social media, and they were actually able to distinguish kind of distinct communities that were trading with each other by looking at interactions on Facebook. Okay, so going back to bats, bats are a really interesting case study to look at global patterns of wildlife exploitation. The key thing is that they are a globally distributed mammal order, but also hunting, trade, and consumption of bats is also widespread, and there are a number of different reasons why people may hunt, consume, or trade bats. So primarily, bats are used in many places as food. So they may be consumed as a delicacy, or in some cases are consumed where other sources of protein are unavailable, or also for ritual purposes. There are also a lot of beliefs that consuming bats has medicinal properties. So, for example, in Indonesia, consuming fruit bat meat is thought to cure asthma. Although this is an intentional use, bats are also heavily persecuted because of their role as crop pests, or their perceived role as crop pests, disease carriers, and just because of a general kind of fear and fear around bats. So in Mauritius, there have actually been several state-sponsored culls of fruit bats because of conflict between large fruit bats and mango growers. This is something that's kind of new, and I'll talk a bit about this later on in the presentation, but one thing that's also emerged in recent years is that bats are also being traded as decorative objects, so kind of preserved specimens are being traded as decorations. So yeah, just to sum up, bats are affected by exploitation globally, and the latest review actually identified that this activity threatens at least 19% of species worldwide. It's also important to note that this isn't a new threat. Bats have been hunted for many thousands of years. Just to give an example, from the early 1960s to the late 1980s, there was a kind of commercialized inter-island trade in fruit bats in the Pacific. And this is showing like an advert at a fish shop for fruit bats because they were really popular as a delicacy. And this trade, because it was so commercialized and actually eventually became unsustainable, several species were added to the CITES Appendix 1, which meant that trade was prohibited, basically. This is a conservation issue, firstly because bats' slow life histories, so their lower rates of reproduction and higher age of reproduction means that unsustainable exploitation where high harvest rates lead to population declines is a lot more likely to happen. And thinking more widely, bats have really important ecological roles, such as pollination, seed dispersal, and in some cases pest control. So actually populations declining as a result of overexploitation can have huge knock-on effects for the rest of the ecosystem. Okay, so to put that all together, so the main aim of my PhD work was to answer this question: can data from online platforms be used to understand the threat of wildlife exploitation at large scales? And I used bats as a case study. Although this PhD was quite sort of methods focused, what I found was that I was actually able to gain some really interesting, cool insights into bat conservation, or that could be applied to bat conservation as a result of testing the methods developed in this PhD. So as I've already said, there is a conservation need. We know that the information on the kind of extent, location, and sustainability of bat hunting is really lacking. But another thing that makes this case study quite interesting, or actually quite challenging, is that high-profile disease outbreaks like COVID-19 have generated a huge amount of commentary around bats. A lot of this is like erroneously linking bat consumption to the COVID-19 outbreak. So this actually makes getting at relevant information a lot more challenging, and also creates that potential for bias. Okay, so there are kind of three key sub-questions that I worked on, and I'm going to go through these during the presentation. So the first question was, does data from online platforms expand or potentially bias our knowledge of the global distribution of bat exploitation? Like, does it tell us anything that we don't already know? And if it does, how can we then use those data to actually map the threat to bats from exploitation? And I mean, two sources that I've already mentioned were social media and online news. So there, the threat of wildlife exploitation is kind of being documented, but there are actually ways in which the internet can facilitate wildlife exploitation, and that's through providing new platforms for wildlife trade to occur. So the third part of my PhD was looking at documentation, well, as opposed to documentation, looking at online trade of bats. Okay, so the first challenge of this work was to actually collect relevant data, and this ended up being hugely complex, and I'm not going to go through all of this now, but if you would like to know more about the data collection methods, we have published a paper on that. But I will give a bit of an overview of what the steps that were involved in this. So we took 4 key platforms: Facebook, Twitter, or it's now known as X, Google, and Bing. And I applied keyword searches, so that would be like bat-related words combined with an exploitation-related word, to the APIs, so that's an application programming interface available for these sites. And one thing that I guess I didn't previously mention was that my PhD is quite focused on automated methods, so building data collection pipelines that can be scaled up to global scales. So that's why we use the kind of programming interface rather than manually collecting the data from these sites. So I took the text from either the websites collected from the search engines or the text collected from the social media posts, and I filtered them using a series of text classifiers. And text classifiers are basically language models or machine learning based models that, with training, are able to identify texts that either are classified as relevant or irrelevant. And in this case, I used 3 classifiers put together in order to sort of peel away layers, like the layers of an onion. At each stage, you get rid of the irrelevant sources, and gradually you get down to what you're really looking for. So the first classifier distinguished texts that were about bats in the animal sense versus any other sense of the word bat, like cricket bat or something like that. And after each classification stage, those that were irrelevant were discarded. The second classifier identified texts that were about bats, just in general terms, versus those that were about bat exploitation. And then finally, as I mentioned, COVID-19 created quite a lot of issues for our data collection, because what we are really interested in is those reports of bat exploitation, like a location that we could use in analysis. But the commentary around COVID-19 created a lot of irrelevant stuff, basically. So the third classifier was used to remove texts that were about the origins of COVID-19. And then even after all that, we were left with texts that were about bats, about bat exploitation, and not about the origins of COVID-19. But we still needed to do some manual review to identify those that were actual reports versus just talking about the subject. So after that, we had our final data set. And for anyone who's interested, those classification models were based on large language models, which we've probably all heard about a lot in the media, but these are actually available kind of off the shelf for researchers to use via the Hugging Face library. And in my case, I took the large language model from this library and fine-tuned it using my own manually labeled examples. Okay, so the interesting bit now is what did these data actually tell us? So just to note, we counted an exploitation record as any source that was documenting hunting, trade, or consumption occurring at a specific location at a specific time point. So one source could actually contain multiple records. And then we compared the distribution, or particularly the geographical distribution of those online records to the geographical distribution of academic studies documenting bat exploitation, and these were obtained from a systematic literature search. Okay, so these are what we found. The bottom map shows the number of academic studies per country, and the top shows the number of online records per country. And what we found is that generally the number of online records per country was predicted by the number of academic studies per country. So there was broad scale like concordance between those data sources, but the online records actually did provide a lot of new locations, more recent records, and 22 additional countries where bat exploitation was occurring that we didn't previously know from the academic studies. A key thing is that in both cases, Southeast Asia and particularly Indonesia was identified as a major global hotspot of bat exploitation. But as well as highlighting the opportunity presented by data from online platforms, what this work also highlighted is that there are some potential issues with these data. So the first is that, as expected, although the volume of online bat exploitation records increased generally in line with the increase in internet use through time, there were peaks in online content that coincided with high-profile disease outbreaks. So we can see a clear peak in 2020, which we believe is as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. The other one is a little bit more puzzling. We suspect it's in 2014, and we suspected that was originally because of the media coverage surrounding Ebola. But then when we looked at the predictions from the generalized additive model, they showed that that peak was actually coming from increased reporting in Asia. So we're still a little bit puzzled as to why that happens. But the main thing is that this does show that there are kind of these like spurious peaks in online content, which makes understanding how the volume of online content relates to actual intensity of exploitation really challenging or impossible. And although there was broad-scale geographic concordance between what we know from academic literature and the new online sources, there were exceptions to that rule. One of those was Madagascar, which had a very high number of academic studies documenting bat exploitation, but very few online records. And we suspect this might be due to the search language that we use, which was English, and also perhaps the lower use of social media or online platforms in that country. Another thing that we noticed was that there was huge geographic and taxonomic differences in geographic and taxonomic resolution between the sources. So they varied from individual bat species being hunted at an individual cave to just someone documenting that they saw a bat in a market in a particular country. So there's this huge variation, and although those are still kind of useful information, bringing those together to build a more detailed picture is quite difficult. Okay, so now we know that online records can generate new knowledge of bat exploitation. We now want to use them to identify more fine-scale patterns of exploitation. So building maps that show threats is broadly known as threat mapping. And as I've already alluded to, this can be a very important conservation decision-making tool. At a global scale, we might use it to identify particular regions that need more funding, for example. But at a smaller scale, we also use threat maps to identify specific locations that might benefit from threat abatement or active restoration. One of those tools is the STAR metric that's used, I think, by businesses to identify locations where that might be most cost effective to invest in threat abatement or restoration. But so how do we use those bat exploitation records that we got from online to generate threat maps like the one shown here? A key challenge is that they are essentially occurrence-only records, so they show only the presence of a threat in a location. Very few of them contain any sort of quantitative information about the number of bats harvested or consumed or being traded. So they're essentially occurrence-only points. And we also know that they're very likely to be spatially biased towards more built-up areas, places that have higher rates of internet access, etc. So the next part of my PhD aimed to investigate whether we could use statistical tools from species distribution modeling to create threat maps from occurrence-only online records. So for those who aren't familiar with species distribution modeling, essentially it's a suite of different approaches that takes presence and or absence data, or so that would be species occurrences, and uses a algorithm to relate the presence of a species to different environmental variables. So this one here is showing annual temperature and grassland cover. And then you then use the species distribution model to predict the potential distribution of the species. So we thought, okay, maybe we could, instead of having species presence or absence data, we might be able to use threat presence data to build a threat map in a similar way that you would build a species distribution map. So to do this, we took a subset of that global data set, and we chose to look at Indonesia, mainly because that was identified as a global hotspot of bat exploitation, and we had the highest number of records there. So basically the better chance of producing a well-performing model. So we took a subset of that global database that was developed with using English language queries and supplemented it with research in the Indonesian language using that same pipeline as I showed earlier on in the presentation. Then I took a number of environmental predictors. So essentially, exploitation is determined by both the availability of the prey species, so in this case bats, and also other things that might drive exploitation, like proximity to protected areas or the accessibility of locations. So we included variables that might relate to both of those, the sort of human behavior side and also the actual distribution of bats. So that, yeah, these are shown here. Population density, administrative region was included to kind of account for socio-cultural differences that might influence the likelihood of bat exploitation occurring in a location. And we combined those point data with the environmental predictors using the Maxent algorithm. And this is one of the most commonly used algorithms. It's a machine learning based algorithm in species distribution modeling. A key advantage is that it can produce quite high performing models with just a small amount of occurrence data. And another advantage is the ability to use bias layers. So as well as presence data, Maxent also requires pseudo absence or background points, and these essentially show the model, the distribution of those environmental predictors in the study area. But using a bias layer, you can essentially select background points that reflect the bias in the occurrence data. So we tested two different bias layers. One was just selecting background points based on the density of the occurrence points. And then given that many of the threat locations were actually documented by people visiting the country, and when we looked at them more closely, we figured that distance to international airports may be having a role on where this threat's being documented, because they might be more accessible to visitors, and visitors may be more likely to be documenting bat trade or consumption because it's kind of novel to them or interesting. And then we use this model to generate predictions of threat occurrence across the whole country. These maps are quite detailed, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of an overview of what we found. So overall, we found that these models do perform quite highly. We tested their performance using both cross-validation and also with a held-out testing data set that was obtained from the locations of the academic studies. And AUC, which is area under the upper rate of receiving curve, was quite high at 0.89. So it shows that generally our model is predicting the occurrence of this threat quite well. One thing that we found, and you can see this clearly, the left side shows trade and consumption and the right side shows hunting probability, that hunting was predicted to occur over a wider area than trade and consumption. And this matches up with what we know about patterns of hunting. People tend to act as central place foragers, so they will hunt wildlife species around a kind of population center of a certain radius, whereas trade and consumption tends to occur at kind of population centers. So that was to be expected. Interestingly, the bias layers did affect the prediction. So the rows of this figure show the use of the different bias layers, but they generally still show the same broad scale patterns. So they indicate that Java and Sulawesi, particularly North Sulawesi, are probably hotspots of bat exploitation. But this isn't actually shown on this figure, but interestingly, when we split the points out by the search language that was used to collect them, that actually had a much greater impact on the probability distributions that were produced for the model. This figure is showing all of the points together, but that shows that using not just English and also using local languages is really important in doing this kind of work. And population density, accessibility, and distance to protected area were the most important predictors of bat exploitation occurrence. So yeah, interesting findings from this work. But this, I would say, these threat maps are just a starting point. They may indicate regions or particular locations where more research is required. But as I'll kind of talk about future research directions a bit later, but what we really need to do is actual field validation to properly test whether these maps are accurately predicting threat occurrence. Okay, so going on to the last part of my work, which was looking at online trade of bats. So as I've already mentioned, wildlife trade has recently shifted from physical markets to more online platforms, and online platforms provide greater access, but also kind of may facilitate new interactions or more international interactions than would have occurred in physical wildlife markets. And as I said, yeah, previous chapters looked at the documentation of threats online, but here we're more interested in how the internet is actually being used to facilitate exploitation. So the decorative trade of bats was actually only first documented in academic literature in 2014, and it was documented at, I think it was a wildlife, a tourist market in Vietnam. But I actually recently had an experience of observing this trade myself. When I was on holiday in Devon, I actually spotted a preserved bat specimen in a kind of gift curio shop. And this is it here. I haven't managed to work out, there was no information on where this was from, what species it was. So it'd be interesting to chat to anyone who might have more ideas about what this could be. But it's super easy to, if you just search for taxidermy bat online, loads of results will come up. But at present, we know very little about this trade. We don't really know at what volume it's occurring, where these bats are being sourced from, what might be driving the trade, even which species are involved. One species that we're quite concerned about is Caravula picta, the painted woolly bat. But there may also be other species that are being heavily targeted for this trade. To my knowledge, there's only been one study of the online trade of bats, which was published in 2021. And that was just a kind of short scale study. I think it was over just 1 or 2 months, where data were manually collected from eBay and Etsy. So given that a lot of my PhD was focused on developing new automated methods to collecting information for bat conservation online, I wanted to see, can I scale this up and apply some of the automated methods that I've already developed to this research question. So I love a flowchart, so I'm going to do another flowchart. So I took a few key phrases that were associated with these listings, and we found these just by doing searches and looking at what searches were kind of most fruitful in returning these products. And again, I used application programming interfaces, and I searched eBay and Etsy every 2 weeks for an 18-month period. To do this, I developed a command line application. So that's like a Python script that can be run automatically at regular intervals. And this allowed us to basically do this data collection over quite a long time period passively. And it just kept on running over that time period. The code to do this is available on my GitHub, which I'll link at the end as well, if anyone's interested in using it. One thing that's important to mention is that the text that's associated with these e-commerce listings is much more standardized in content, language, and length than the social media posts and the news articles or web articles that I was working with in the first part of my PhD. And what that meant is that this data collection phase was a lot simpler than that previous pipeline that I showed before. So here I first just used some keyword filtering. So there were particular words that basically indicated that the listing wasn't relevant. It wasn't a bat, it wasn't a preserved bat or a specimen. Things like t-shirt, sticker, that just showed me that's not what we're interested in. So I used those keywords to do the first step of filtering. And then I used another machine learning model, and in this case it was a neural network, which is a slightly simpler machine learning model than the actually a lot simpler than the large language models. And I trained that with 1,000 manually labeled training and testing examples. And then after that step of filtering, I was left with all of the bat relevant listings. One thing that I didn't do in the first, when I was developing my global bat exploitation database, was automate the extraction of information. And again, that was because those sources were really, really messy, and we basically needed to manually extract data from them. But in this case, because of the more standardized format, and also the fact that anything that was relevant, we know it's definitely trading bats, if that makes sense. So it's a lot more constrained in its content. So we were able to also use automated methods to extract information here. So the whole pipeline was end-to-end automated. I used a tool called named entity recognition to identify taxonomic names. So this is actually a real example that we found. So here we would identify a painted bat and also the species names as taxonomic entities. And I did that using the TaxoNerd Python library. I also identified any mentions of location. So here, UK and Indonesia was mentioned. So that was identified using the Spacey Python library. And then all of the listings were also associated with some metadata. So that included the seller ID, which we did anonymize, the location of the seller, the price of the object, the date that it was listed, and for Etsy, they also included inventory data. Okay, so what did we find? Over the whole time period, we gathered over 1 million results. But after all this filtering and deduplication, this actually only resulted in 4,608 unique, that's it, the key thing, unique relevant listings. And because we were sampling regularly every 2 weeks, a lot of the same listings or the same products were being returned time and time again. So this doesn't necessarily mean that there were only 4,608 bats sold. It just means that there was the number of different products that were being advertised for sale. And that was 13% of the original data set, which just demonstrates how important these automated approaches are for collecting data at scale. I found that actually the majority, or just over half of all the listings, mentioned a particular species. And as a result, we found that there were 47 different species listed for sale in total. Most of these species were least concern, but there were some that weren't. For example, Caravula picta, which you've already mentioned, is near threatened, and it's particularly concerning because they occur only in small groups or sometimes solitary, so they're at very low densities, meaning that someone has gone to a real effort potentially to collect these bats. Another one that's a bit concerning is Otomops formosus, which is the Javan Mastiff bat. Again, it's data deficient, so we don't even really have much information on its, well, we have no information on its conservation status, population trend, or even, and we also lack kind of basic understanding of its ecology. Sorry. Interestingly, there was only one listing relating to a CITES listed species, and that was Pteropus vampirus. Because it's in the Pteropus genus, it's only on Appendix 2, which means that trade is allowed, but a permit needs to be obtained in order to trade that species. But in that listing, there was no mention of CITES at all, which is, yeah, curious, not really sure. I mean, this trade is completely unregulated. There's no, there's no rules about how or what can be traded currently. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. One thing that I did to identify potential sourcing hotspots was take the ranges of the species that were being traded online and overlaid them. And this shows that South and Southeast Asia are most likely hotspots of sourcing for this trade. But then when we compare that to the location of the sellers, there is a massive distinction. So the USA by far was the most location where most of these products were being sold from. But also the UK, Canada, Australia, China, Hong Kong, and some other countries in Europe were also identified as places where these products are being sold from. So I guess this shows that the demand is the demand or the consumption of these products or of these decorative bat objects is completely different to where they're being sourced from. And it's a highly international trade. Okay, so I'm going to start summing up and talking about some applications of these findings. So the first part of my PhD, we basically found that online platforms are really useful in providing additional knowledge of threats to bats. They reflect what we currently already know, but there are some exceptions, and those spurious peaks in online content present a challenge to the interpretation of temporal trends. Next, I found that statistical approaches from species distribution modeling can be really useful in building threat occurrence models from presence-only threat data, but we need to be careful about the language that's being used to obtain these data to feed into the models, and also think about using bias layers. And finally, we found that bat species are being traded internationally at potentially high volumes, and these are facilitated by kind of very well-known e-commerce platforms such as eBay and Etsy. And it's entirely unregulated, with demand from Europe and North America likely fueling exploitation in Southeast Asia. So what does this mean for bat conservation? So I guess what it shows is that bat exploitation is actually more extensive than we previously thought. The legal protection of bats or bat roosts, it massively varies globally. So in the UK and Europe, for example, bats are afforded a very high level of protection, but that is not the case in many other places. So essentially, we need to massively scale up the protection of bats, and also interventions to address unsustainable exploitation. What my PhD also showed is that automated methods can be a really useful tool for rapidly detecting and responding to emerging threats. So I by no means am suggesting that these data are a replacement for detailed systematic surveys, but the advantage that they do have is that they can be collected dynamically, very quickly, and at large scales. So things like the IUCN Red List are often criticised for being out of date, because the process of gathering the evidence needed to do an IUCN Red List assessment is very long. So my suggestion is that perhaps we could now start to think about integrating these kind of online data sets into assessments, and also perhaps into CITES listings when we're looking at online wildlife trade, as well as highlighting kind of the usefulness of these methods. What this PhD has also shown is that some key locations and species that are definitely needed more attention. So in all chapters of the PhD, Southeast Asia was identified as the key hotspot of this threat. And that's kind of concerning because it's also a hotspot of bat diversity. So I hope this highlights that much more funding and research and intervention is needed in this region. And also it's also highlighted a couple of species that are perhaps also in need of some more research. For example, those two that I've already mentioned is the Java mastiff bat and the painted woolly bat, which are data deficient and near threatened. Again, the online sources only indicate the presence of the threat, but we still don't have any information on the harvesting rates, and actually in some cases we don't have any information on the population status either. So that is definitely greatly needed. So what are the future research directions? So we definitely need to do validation through field surveys. The online analyses are definitely a first step. They indicate places where we may need to collect more data, so that they're prioritization tool in essence, but they aren't able to tell us about the sustainability of wildlife harvests, and we really need to validate our models with field surveys. And also, as I mentioned, we have these spurious temporal peaks in online content, but what we do need to understand is how those actually relate to impact or population trends. We need to expand searches to more languages. Mine was only conducted in English simply because adding a globally representative sample of languages would have been an overwhelmingly large task. But now that I have the pipeline set up, we could potentially adapt it for use with more languages, as I did with the Indonesian language search. And the threat maps developed in my kind of spatial modeling chapter did provide some insights into things that are predicting exploitation, like human population density, but also much local studies are required to identify those specific drivers of exploitation, which is essential for designing interventions. And that's it from me, and thank you so much for listening. I'd also want to acknowledge my PhD supervisors, Fiona Matthews and Julie Weeds, and also my collaborator, Malik Odin. I've put QR codes here for the papers mentioned, and also my GitHub. And if anyone here is attending EBRS, I will be talking more about my online trade chapter on Thursday.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that super interesting talk, Bronwen. If anyone has any questions, please just post them in the chat. We have a few minutes left for questions. In the meantime, while people are thinking of their own questions, I did have one question about the drivers of threat occurrence that you found, and you mentioned distance to protected areas as one of them. And I was just curious, what was the direction of that relationship? Was it closer to protected areas, was higher?
So yeah, this was an interesting one because the curve was not linear. This isn't something that I included in the presentation, but what you can do from your MaxNet models is actually extract response curves. And what we found with the distance protected areas is that initially the closer to the protected area, I'm trying to get this right, but essentially if there was close proximity to the protected area, the closer there was, the higher the rate of exploitation. But then when that was further away, that trend reversed, if that makes sense.
And was there any interaction with, because you also had accessibility, I think, as one of the, so I just wonder if those two.
I don't think accessibility, I think, showed a similar curve to the population trends, population density, sorry, where again, initially there was like an initial, so population density, the higher the population density, the higher the chance of exploitation. But again, that was initially rose, and then as the population density and accessibility got much higher, so it was essentially a major population centre, that actually relationship decreased. So the higher that population or the accessibility, there was less chance that exploitation was occurring. But we didn't look at interactions between those variables, but that would also be something interesting to explore.
Sounds like a very quite a complex
set
of drivers. So yeah, we have a question from Rachel, saying really interesting work. How do you think these results could be used to inform conservation efforts to reduce bad exploitation, like, for example, public engagement events in hotspots or working with customs authorities?
Yeah, I mean, all of those suggestions are things that I think would be really good applications of this work. I think one thing that we really need in order to really apply these results in practice is to continue the data collection. So, for example, with the online trade work, I think this does have potential to kind of to inform CITES listing perhaps, but it needs to be continued over a longer period, I would say. At this point, I think that the models or the results from the online analyses are just one part of the picture. But I think, for example, when we're designing public engagement or kind of enforcement interventions, that kind of thing, you need both that bigger picture, but also the locally relevant information. So I think those two things work hand in hand. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And also, I guess there may be sort of different types of conservation efforts required on, I'm just thinking of the last part of your presentation where the sort of source locations of the species that are being sold, and then the locations of the sellers and presumably the buyers of those bats are quite different. So yeah, I just wonder if you had any sort of insights on.
Well, I guess, I mean, that does point to the different interventions are required in different locations. So, for example, interventions that are designed to reduce demand are much more likely to be required in those sourcing locations, whereas interventions to kind of understand the or research and interventions to understand and address the drivers of actual exploitation or harvesting are much more likely to be required in those source countries. But I think another thing with relating to the online trade, this is really interesting because it's still so unknown, is that we actually don't have much of an idea of that supply chain yet. We can see that there's this distinction between source and sale, but the bit in between is still very unknown. So again, future research directions, I think.
Yeah, not definitely. There's more sort of comments on. Thank you very much for your really interesting presentation. We have just a couple of minutes left. I can't see any more questions on the chat, so I'm just going to ask another question in relation to the importance of language and how that potentially biases some of the results. So you mentioned it as a sort of potential future avenue, just conducting these kind of searches in languages other than English. What's your sort of gut feeling in terms of if and how the results might change if you include other languages?
I think mainly it would improve the kind of coverage of the data set and the reliability of the data set. I think I just saw one of the comments in the chat about how some parts of Zambia have really bad internet exposure, and I think that's a very key point, is that these online data are never going to capture absolutely everything, and so they may actually be more suitable in countries or locations where we know that there is broad scale in access to internet. So at the global scale, I'm not sure if it would massively change those patterns that we saw, because we already know that they do kind of reflect what we already know in the academic literature. But I think it would provide, greater resolution of the data and just, a more complete picture.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that sort of addresses one of the latest questions that was just posted in the chat. Our hour is up, so I think we're gonna let you go, and just thank you again for presenting this really interesting research and taking the time to answer our questions. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you continue to join us in upcoming webinars, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your days. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks, Bronwen.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening.